afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I'm going to try to do something that I probably need to be doing more of, and that is I want to talk just a little bit and I want to listen a lot. We are now in what we call our President's Day recess in the United States Congress. And I need not tell you that, as the old Chinese proverb goes, may you live in interesting times. These are interesting times. These are challenging times for the nation, thankfully a little less challenging for those of us in Texas, but the trend lines are not in a good direction at the moment. I'm sure most of you have followed the national debate and the legislation that has been passed in Washington. Ever since we came into the economic recession, I've been concerned at the legislative response in Washington, D.C. As many of you know, I did not support the original bailout legislation. I did not support the second bailout legislation. If I had a third opportunity, I'd probably vote against it again. Since we've gone down that road under what is called the TARP program, you know, in Washington we excel at acronyms. But $700 billion of your money has now been committed. And I think a lot of it has done marginal good at best. I think to some extent people in Washington have made the problem worse. You don't deserve a bunch of happy talk, nobody. You deserve a bunch of doom and gloom. You deserve people shooting straight with you. I think to some extent, particularly under the previous administration, that language was used that helped convince people that we were on the precipice of the next Great Depression. Clearly, we are in challenging economic times, but I don't see us on the precipice of the next Great Depression. I am fearful of all this debt that we are racking up and having very little to show for it. Prior to the initial bailout pieces of legislation, we were looking at about $54 trillion of unfunded obligations of the government, which breaks down to about $144,000 for every man, woman, and child. Almost $500,000 for a family of 4. That's before we started adding on all of this. The activities of the United States Treasury pale in comparison to those of the Federal Reserve. I saw a report on Bloomberg. It's hard to keep track of all the bailouts. We're up to somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 to $8 trillion of taxpayer liability through the activities of both the Treasury and the Fed, with most of it coming from the Federal Reserve. Now, having said all of that, notwithstanding the fact that I am an economic conservative, I do believe that we are in the midst of a legitimate crisis. Now, that term is used every day in Washington, D.C. This was one of the few times I actually believed it. I supported alternative legislation that would have used the full faith and credit of the United States of America for on a temporary basis, paid for by Wall Street, to help insure some of these questionable assets. But that legislation did not carry the day. And as some of you know, I'm one of 5 individuals in this nation who are on the Congressional Oversight Panel for this TARP program. And it's not a pretty picture. Having said that, we have a new administration. The president had strong feelings about a stimulus package. I agree the economy needs a stimulus package, but we needed a package that stimulated the economy and not the government. I fear the legislation that was passed did a whole lot more to stimulate big government than it did the economy. I believe ultimately Wall Street will not lead us out of this recession. I do not believe government will lead us out of this recession. I believe small business entrepreneurs in our community financial institutions is what will lead us out of this recession. Thus, the purpose of the meeting. I'm trying to set up roundtables with small business people throughout the 5th Congressional District so I can listen to your ideas on what I can do to make sure that, number one, you preserve the jobs you have today, and number two, we give you opportunities to expand those jobs and the success of your business tomorrow. The piece of legislation that was passed last week, contrary to my vote, number one, is very expensive. It's the single most expensive piece of legislation ever passed in the entire history of our nation. That in and of itself should be worrisome. Although its advertised price tag was about $780 billion, we're putting it on the credit card, not paying cash, so you have to add in the interest, and it takes it up to about $1.2 trillion, or almost $10,000 for every household in America is the cost of this. And even if you were a Keynesian economist, which I am not, but Keynesian economics says that government spending, which is immediate, can have an impact in getting the economy going again. But less than, to the best of our knowledge, less than about 5% of this legislation had anything to do with what we would call shovel-ready infrastructure projects, which is classical Keynesian economics. Less than 1% of the legislation had anything to do with tax relief for small businesses, principally in the area of net operating loss and 179 expensing. 17% of the legislation encompasses new tax relief for people who pay taxes. Now, the advertised number is larger than that, but part of that encompasses preventing future tax increases, and part of that encompasses giving income tax relief to people who don't pay income taxes, which may be important as welfare, but it is not tax relief. Over 80% of the legislation then either is growing government as we know it, funding 119 programs, 32 new programs, 19 of which the Office of Management and Budget says is either ineffective or can show no results. It's buying $600 million for new cars for the government, new furniture for the National Institute of Health, a program for education on sexually transmitted diseases, a new after-school snack program, a train from Las Vegas to Los Angeles or vice versa, and the list goes on. Most of the money not to be spent for years. And a lot of this is what we call entitlement spending, which means it'll just keep on growing and growing and growing. Having said that, elections have consequences. This was passed, it was the law of the land. As an aside, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, conservative, liberal, or independent, the process stinks. Congress was handed a 1,400-page bill at 12:35 midnight on the day that we were to vote on it. We voted on the bill within 12 hours of being presented 1,400 pages of material. I was asked to vote on that bill before I read it. And by the way, I was not up at midnight to look at the bill. Every American should be outraged that as a nation we didn't have at least 72 hours to read that bill online and have input to our elected officials on whether or not we wanted them to support that. So as you know, I try to shoot straight with you. I do have strong opinions, but one of my strongest opinions is that I want to figure out how to help small business help grow us out of this economic recession. So with that, let me quit talking, and I came here to listen, and I've got a pad of paper, and I got a pen, and I got Richard Sanders, who's got 2 ears as well. And I would like to start hearing from y'all on what you think what we can do in Washington to get off your back and help you grow us out of this recession.
I've got a question first. It would appear, based on what I read, that this stimulus package is either the first or second of many Next one being commercial real estate, banks, on and on and on. How many stimulus packages can the government afford since they can't afford the one they're in?
Well, if you didn't hear the question was, there's an understanding that there will be other stimulus bills, and how many can we afford? And we can't afford the ones that we've already passed. So how many more, limited only by the imagination of members of Congress in the administration, could be passed? And I'll take an opportunity. You know, it's not just economic theory that I base my no vote on, it's economic history. The tax relief that is in the so-called stimulus package is a one-time rebate. I want to say it's something like $1.50 a day in temporary tax relief. In the last Congress, we had temporary tax rebates that we were told was going to stimulate the economy. Well, it didn't work. Many of y'all may be familiar with Japan's lost decade. Japan in the 1980s and early 90s had what they called their lost decade. They went on a stimulus spending spree, as I fear we may be on the verge of doing. It's interesting, I have a story from the New York Times, not exactly a bastion of conservative thought, that talks about it. But in a decade, Japan took on, in a series of stimulus programs, the highest per capita debt of any industrialized nation in the world. I want to say they passed, I think it was 8 stimulus bills in 10 years. And in that time, their debt went to number 1 in the world. They had no growth in their economy for over a decade. They created no new net jobs. And their per capita income went from 2nd in the world to 10th in the world. There's a sentence in this New York Times article that analyzed it. It says, during that time, Japan accumulated the largest public debt in the developed world, totaling 180% of its $5.5 trillion economy, while failing to generate a convincing recovery. Now the Obama administration embarks on a similar path, proposing to spend more than $800 billion to stimulate the sagging American economy, causing economists to take a fresh look at Japan. And there's another sentence here. Among ordinary Japanese, the spending is widely disparaged for having turned the nation into a public works-based welfare state and making regional economies dependent on Tokyo for jobs. Anyway, for those of you who want to go online, it's a February 6 New York Times article. It's kind of a quick study of what took place in Japan, and I don't care for America to repeat Japan's mistakes.
I just wanted to thank you for your stand, that you're speaking to a guy that's a conservative to the right of Attila the Hun, I think, and you're representing my views, and I'm so glad you're able to just stay with it and that you haven't caved in. I appreciate it.
Well, give me some ideas of things I can work on.
Congressman, what is your take on what seems to be the bully pulpit of we need to give security, mental security, to the consuming public of this country, or the spending public of this country? Is it as bad as some people say, that there is no faith out there, that the people have no faith the economy is halfway decent, or is it almost a situation where it's been ingrained in our heads through the press that we're in the toilet? What's your take on it? What do you hear?
Well, I think we're facing a couple of challenges, and one of them is psychological. Maybe Jerry King could help me here, but I want to say in America's history, we've gone through about 35 financial panics. This is not the first financial panic we've had. This recession's a little different than than most, but there is a psychological component to it. But I got to tell you, if you're going to have your leadership in Congress, and to some extent, two presidents in a row tell you we're on the precipice of a cliff, I don't know why anybody would want to start a business in America, expand a business in America, invest in America. And I'm saying this about both administrations. Y'all know I'm a conservative Republican, but I was disappointed in our previous Secretary of Treasury, who was an appointee of President Bush, who essentially told us, if you do not pass my bailout bill, we'll be in the next Great Recession. And I have met our new president, who's a very smart man, a very earnest man, a very sincere man. But I was disappointed when I heard from him something similar, and that is either pass my stimulus bill or the economy is going to fall apart. I don't think that serves the nation well, and frankly, I don't think it is correct. But I do believe there is a legitimate, unfortunately, psychological component to the challenge we have in front of us. And so the financial markets are the circulatory system of our economy. And I know we have a number of bankers here. Unfortunately, you've run your banks better than a lot of people on Wall Street ran their banks. But you know how the economy can contract when people are panicking. Part of what we need, I think there's several things that we need to do to address the psychology. Number one, if I was president of the United States, and by the way, I never expect to be, but if I was, I would call on President Obama to have a series of fireside chats, not unlike FDR had. I won't go quite as far as to say that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, but we do have to fear a lot of fear. And to point out, I don't know why, but America has to learn a lot of history lessons over and over. Yes, there's been financial panics. Yes, there will be pain. But America has come through previous financial panics. We're going to come through this one. And we'll be fine. We're going to come through this one as well. It's going to take hard work. It's going to take sacrifice. But we'll get there. He, more than anybody else, has the largest bully pulpit in America. He could do a lot to address psychology. Second of all, our markets need certainty. I don't know why anybody wants to invest in our major financial institutions when they're sitting here saying, well, is Congress going to bail me out? Is Congress going to bail my competitor out? Is Congress going to bail my customer out? You know, if I'm behind on my mortgage and my bank contacts me and says, you're behind on your mortgage, let's get together, let's see if we can work out a payment plan, I'm thinking, well, why do I want to talk to my banker? I'm reading in the headlines where Congress is about to renegotiate my mortgage for me, maybe get a better deal. And if I'm current on my mortgage, maybe I should think about defaulting so I can benefit from the government program. There's a difference between I won't pay my mortgage and I can't pay my mortgage. There's a difference. And so I think that, you know, again, if I was Speaker of the House, and I don't ever expect to be Speaker of the House, I would have a press conference and I'd say, here's the policy. Here's the policy. If you're a homeowner, here's the policy. If you're a financial institution, here's the policy. If you're on Wall Street, here's the policy. We're not changing it. Get to work. We need some certainty, and we don't have it. So those are two things that I think I would do to try to treat the psychological component. And then the getting more capital into the market. I believe I would zero out the capital gains tax for 2 years. If you would come and you would take capital and invest it in America and create jobs, I would give you zero tax for 2 years. There's a psychological component and then there's a capital component, and that's what I would do. Banker?
Yes, sir. By necessity, in many cases, small businesses are C corporations. And as you know, after the death tax, probably the next most unfair tax is the double taxation of earnings. by the time the C corporation recognizes them and then eventually the stockholder recognizes them. And, you know, we've had the 15% qualified dividend tax over the last few years, which has helped, but I understand that's likely to go away at some point in the future. What do you think about, you know, continuing to make it easier for C corps to file as S corps? And one of the big impediments for small businesses is the limitation against family limited partnerships. So if we could get some S corp legislation out there that would allow for families to convert over, that would be very helpful. The other thing I was curious about is if for small businesses, if you could make a certain portion of the dividends that they pay tax deductible, like interest.
Those are all good ideas, and I embrace them. One, we shouldn't be wedded to the entity, and particularly when it comes to corporate taxation. I mean, there are those in America who like to play upon kind of class warfare. And I was heartened by a statement the president made the other day, which at least leads me to believe that he doesn't want to play that card. Many of y'all know in America we have the second highest rate of corporate taxation of any industrialized nation in the world. I have supported legislation that would bring that top rate down from 35 to 25%, which is kind of the median of the European Union, which tends to be our main competitor. But there's no doubt about it, corporations don't pay taxes, only people pay taxes. And when we're talking about what we need to do to preserve and grow jobs in America, one of the things we can do is have a massive reduction of that corporate rate of taxation. That is helping send jobs overseas. And related to that, you saw the president announce executive compensation guidelines for, I don't quite remember the phrase he used, but those who especially took a lot of the bailout money. I don't want government setting artificial limits on pay or setting artificial limits on the American dream, but men and women, when it comes to taxpayer dollars, you have got to set limits. It's just what people do with their money is their business. What they do with taxpayer money, I make it my business. So I'm still studying the commas and the semicolons in the president's plan, but I believe I certainly embrace the concept of what he's trying to do. I don't like it. I don't like the fact that we're here, but we can't have people on Wall Street, you know, who essentially privatize their profits and socialize their losses. To take $3 million bonuses last year and then expect their bailout this year. But I will say as an aside, I don't want to wake up because capital can go overseas. And I don't want to chase our best talent overseas because all these people running financial institutions can do them out of London just as well as they do them out of New York, as you well know. So there is a bit of a balance. But I also want people to be incented to get their business in order and to get off the taxpayer dime. And so I think those compensation limits, as painful as they may be, number one, are fair, and number two, are probably needed. But those are good ideas on the pass-through entity and the corporate rate of taxation. Don't turn shy on me all of a sudden. Well, hold on, let me see if there's anybody new. If not, we'll go to the folks who've already asked a question.
You know, we're bailing out Wall Street. If you call a securities broker today and say, I've got money I want to spend, the plan he's going to lay out for you is, number one, you want global stocks. Number two, you want to invest in gold and silver. And number three, you want a high level of liquidity. Now, we're bailing him out, and none of the three plans he's suggesting to investors will help the U.S. in any way.
Is that a statement or a question?
I don't quite know how to respond to that.
No, it's a statement, but, you know, it's back to what is the attitude of America? Well, the attitude of America right now is, I'd rather put my U.S. currency in foreign currency and hedge on it. And I do have a question, if I may ask it too.
Please.
What is the bailouts going to do to inflation and to the value of the dollar versus other currencies?
The question was, what will the bailouts do to inflation? Again, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not an expert at econometrics, but my gut tells me that in the short term, we could have a deflation challenge, and in the longer term, we are going to have one huge inflation challenge. I fear that we could be repeating the late 70s, early 80s, a period of stagflation. You may recall the misery index. Add the interest rate to the unemployment rate, to the inflation rate, and you get the misery index. I think I recall, some of you may know this better than I was in college at the time, but we were looking at interest rates that were pretty close to 20%. We had double-digit inflation. We had unemployment that was higher than it is today. And so that was classic stagflation. And so Chairman Bernanke is a big student of the Great Depression. He is not going to make the same mistake that was made then. And the biggest mistake in the Great Depression was allowing the money supply to contract about a quarter overnight. Most economic historians will tell you that the Great Depression would have been a garden variety recession had it not been for poor monetary policy. So he's bending over backwards to do the opposite, and that is to pour lots and lots of money into the system. You can essentially borrow money from the Federal Reserve. Well, you can. Some of these guys in this audience can. You can essentially borrow money from the Federal Reserve for zero real interest rates. They are pouring so much what we call liquidity into the system, but it's a whole lot easier to pour it in than it is to take them out. And since the economic recession is not a localized recession, frankly, it's a global recession, the Chinese are going to start borrowing, the EU is going to start borrowing, and as I've said before, I always think it's kind of funny when members of Congress quote themselves, but the only thing worse than the Chinese buying our debt is the Chinese not buying our debt. And all of a sudden, real interest rates could spike. People are questioning, do I want to invest in the U.S. economy? And now, again, just this one stimulus bill has about a $350 billion interest price tag associated with the $750 billion of government spending. And I'm not sure who's going to buy all their debt. And there comes a point where you start crowding out the lending needs of small business people in Henderson County, Texas. And it's going to be, I'm very, very fearful that we could see a period of very high inflation, which is, particularly for our elderly on fixed incomes, is just devastating. Now, again, right now, at this point in kind of the cycle of the financial panic, you could see a deflation problem, but we are quickly going to see an inflation problem. And again, I don't know what to tell you. Elections have consequences. The legislation has been passed, and I certainly don't see it being reversed in the next 2 years.
The one thing that I have not quite been able to get my mind around is I don't see any business plan from the people who are being given the opportunity for the bailout funds. And from a business perspective, we rise and fall based on our risk ratios. And without these business plans coming in there, and are they legitimately managing their internal operations, reducing costs where they can, right enough? Nobody ever hears that. Is any of that going on?
I would say after the fact. After the fact, yes. And again, I didn't vote for the original bailout proposal, which isn't to say that I didn't believe that we needed an extraordinary government response. I just didn't believe in that one. The capital purchase program of injecting capital into the major financial institutions. Congress we had the CEOs of the 8 largest financial institutions that took that money, and we had a public pillaring of them. You might have seen it on television. It was great sport in Congress to slap all these guys around. And some of it was deserved. But as I say, what'd your mom always teach you when you pointed at somebody? You got one finger pointed at you, you got 3 fingers pointed at yourself. I'm not sure what you're doing with the thumb. My point is, Congress passed a law that said we're going to give you money and you don't have to tell us how you spend it, and we have no measurement of success. That's Congress's fault. Congress passed that law, and now they want to blame everybody in our financial institutions. And I said, well, you wrote the law. It's your law. Anyway, when I became a member of the Congressional Oversight Panel for this turkey, I guess I'm mixing my agricultural metaphors here, but it's kind of like the whole horse was already out of the barn, but the tail. The first tranche of money, I want to say like 300 of the 350 billion was already gone before I could show up. But which still isn't to say it was a totally valueless procedure. I think from public perception standpoint, to see the full faith and credit of the United States getting behind the major financial institutions, I haven't concluded that was necessarily a mistake in helping treat the psychology of the market and maybe stopping us from doing an even worse reversal. I certainly thought more of the capital purchase program than the toxic asset repurchase program. If there's one group of folks that I do not trust to purchase these assets, to know how to buy them, what price to pay for them, how to manage them, it's the people who brought you the single largest deficit in America's history. And I also am desperate to ensure that members of Congress do not have a seat at the board of directors for every small business in America. And I'm fearful that we are on a path of nationalizing our banking industry and to politicize every lending process in America, to pick winners and losers. Our second tranche of money under TARP purposely earmarked money to the auto industry. Now, once you get away from dealing with the circulatory system of our economy, you're into picking winners and losers. According to the Wall Street Journal, and I haven't had a chance to ask him this personally, but Chairman Barney Frank, chairman of the Financial Services Committee that I serve on, the Wall Street Journal says that he wrote the TARP legislation and added a provision to help one single bank in his district. That's what you're looking at when you nationalize our banking system. One of the reasons that we are in the economic turmoil we're in now is because government policy mandated, cajoled, and incented financial institutions to lend money to people who couldn't afford to pay it back. That's what Fannie and Freddie were all about. Totally creatures of the United States Congress. Now, maybe the intention was noble. Everybody in America should own a home. But instead of bringing down the credit standards of our financial institutions, we need to figure out how do we lift up the borrower, not bring down the lender. But we've brought down the lender, and now we're paying the price for it.
Your horse metaphor is pretty good. I think most of us agree that most of the horses' tails are still in Congress. The big struggle that it seems like...
And I know them each by name.
It seems like that when a nation loses its industry, the nation becomes a stepchild of the nations that have the industry. And then, the big steel and all the costs of problems with the automakers are everybody knows them. But there's emerging markets. There are new technologies, and there's businesses that are on the horizon for this country. And but it seems like that we want to beat our breast and say, oh, we've got to save these guys, but we're not paying any attention to where are we going in the future. For instance, green. You know, green's a big buzzword nowadays, and a lot of people are breathing heavy about the idea of green, but what are we doing about it? There's a lot of industry to be generated from green.
Well, one, you're talking to a guy who used to be an officer in a green energy company. It's one of the things I did before going to Congress. So I am hopeful that as time goes by, that my children are going to have an opportunity to one day be off the electrical grid, have solar paneled homes, drive around in hydrogen-powered cars. And I believe in that future, but I believe that future is probably 25 years away. I do not believe it is 5 years away. And in the meantime, people have to feed their families, drive to work, and pay their health care premiums. I'm concerned about the state of manufacturing in America, but I'm not a protectionist. I try to go to the root cause of the problem. I think the root cause of the problem has to do with too much taxation, too much litigation, too much regulation, and not enough education. America does not produce scientists. America does not produce engineers. There's a film out, what's it called? 1,000 Hours, 1,000 Minutes. It's a film about 4 years in a Chinese high school, 4 years in an Indian high school, and 4 years in American high school. I feel guilty, I'm just telling you about a movie I haven't seen, but I've heard about it. And supposedly and I need to see it, but it will open your eyes about why we are getting, I know the press is here, so I guess I can't say we're getting our fannies kicked, but why we are losing the battle in manufacturing with the Chinese and the Indians. So again, I want to address the root causes. And when you talk about green, there's a downside to it. There's a balance. A lot of the regulations that prevent manufacturing from being profitable at home, frankly, are environmental regulations. And we have to appreciate the fact that clean air and clean water, and at what level do we want them, has a cost. It has a cost. I think I got time for one more. It's what Richard's telling me, and as y'all know, he's bigger than me, so I'll just do what he says. What was yours?
Well, first of all, I'd like to disagree with the idea that we're losing our manufacturing base. If you look at the manufacturing base in this country, the high-end products that nobody else can build, we're building.
That's true.
Caterpillar, John Deere, computers, and sure, some of that is built overseas, but those are American companies building overseas, and a certain amount of that comes back to this country. But my question to you is why is it Congress continues to believe that they're too big to fail? When Henry Ford came out with the mass production of the automobile, the buggy manufacturers and the buggy whip manufacturers either adapted or went out of business. That should be true for the automotive industry in this country. It should be true because the Japanese have built all these plants in this country with modern plants, good automobiles, and American workers, and making a good living. So why does the Congress think they should rescue the automobile industry? They rescued the airline industry, and look what shape it's in.
Congress
Is rescue the healthcare industry?
Or the oil industry.
Well, thank you. Frankly, I use these arguments on the House floor. I mean, it's about picking winners and losers. I don't know of any industry that's not hurting in this economy. I don't know of any industry. How do I say yes to the automakers and then I say no to the airlines? And then if I say yes to the airlines, how do I say no to the tourist industry? And if I say yes to the tourist industry, again, where does it stop? Where does it stop? As an aside, and you kind of alluded to it, it begs the question, what's an American-made car? Is it a Toyota made in Alabama, or is it a GM made in Canada?
Yeah.
To some extent, why the big three are having the problems they're having, and by the way, they've worked on these problems for 20 or 30 years. This is not an overnight phenomenon. The economic crisis has brought it to a head, but their total compensation packages have been about a third to 40% higher than their competitors, particularly their legacy, retirement, and health care cost. You can't do that. Most of the Toyota and Honda plants in the South are not unionized. Most of the plants in the North, GM and Ford and Chevrolet, are unionized. I want everybody in America to make how much ever money they can, but even, there was a former head of the UAW, Walter, I forget his name, Ruther, who I think once said, you know, more and more pay for fewer and fewer hours ultimately is a losing proposition. Now, I'm not sure his successor union bosses figured that out, but that's definitely. Go broke and somebody buys the airplanes, puts a new coat of paint on them, and they keep flying. That plant and equipment is not going to go away. Listen, I don't want this to happen. I don't want the big three to go belly up. But life is full of lousy options, and it's one of the reasons that we have Chapter 11 reorganization. You hold the creditors at bay, you get it reorganized, you make it tighter, leaner, cleaner, meaner, more competitive, and you come back. Bankruptcy is not always a death knell. Sometimes it's a rebirth. And if it's a choice of either investors losing money or taxpayers losing money, I think investors ought to lose the money and not taxpayers. Anyway, we are out of time, but thank you very much for coming. Please let me know as time goes by any ideas you have that would benefit small business in Henderson County. I want to help. Thank you very much.